Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, a few weeks ago I treated this guitar here. This is my 92 Les Paul Standard with the throwback SLE 101 PAF pickups in it to a new set of pots. Now in pretty much all of my guitars, especially the Gibsons, I use VIPots, which are the closest thing on the market nowadays to replicas of the old Centralab pots that would have been used in old Gibsons. But the pots this guitar has in it currently were put together by a chap called Taylor Speers over in Texas, otherwise known as Nostalgic. Now, back in the day, Centralab made pots for a variety of different applications. Some of them went in burst Les Pauls, but many others went in televisions and cars and radios and things like that. And those tended to be much bigger pots. But the only thing that was actually different about them was the physical casing dimensions. Internally, the carbon track and the wiper were exactly the same as what went in burst Les Pauls. So what Taylor does is he gets those much bigger Centralab pots, takes out the internals and houses them in CTS enclosures to create hybrid pots. So they look like 500k CTS pots, the casings are from CTS 500k pots, but everything that actually makes a difference to how the pot sounds and behaves is genuine vintage original Centralab, and it's a much more affordable way of using real Centralab components in your burster-like Les Paul than trying to find original guitar-sized Centralab pots, because one of those can run you hundreds of pounds or dollars used, let alone new old stock. Now, as we heard in that video, the VI pots in comparison to the Nostalgics were a little bit thicker in the lower mid-range. The Nostalgics seem to have a little bit more kind of clarity in the lower mids and a bit more kind of bite and snap in the upper mid-range. Now, some of that would have been down to the slight differences in values between the pots, but there was a slight EQ difference overall that was kind of universal even when the pots were pretty much exactly the same value. They weren't colossal differences, but they did make this guitar sound 1% closer to what I associate with burst tone by thinning out the lower mids and adding that kind of snap in the upper mid-range. Now today we're going to make a part 2 to that video and take the concept one step further, because here I have a new set of pots from Nostalgic and these read in at a fair bit higher value than 500k. The volumes are 930 and 850 and the tones are 740 and 760. Now the reason for doing this is kind of twofold really. Firstly, the original Centralab pots that were used in burst Les Pauls did have a habit of reading in at a fair bit higher than 500k. Now Taylor has recently got hold of an original guitar-sized Centralab pot from the late 50s. It's never been used, never had anything soldered onto it, and it actually measures in at 675k. So some Les Pauls back in the 50s would have had 500k pots in, others will have had 700k pots in from new. So that's the first thing. The second and possibly most interesting thing is people who are lucky enough to own original burst Les Pauls very often go on forums and measure their pot values today. And in many instances, they read in at a fair bit higher than 675k. And very often they're kind of up in the 7, 8, 900k range today in 2022. Now, the theory that kind of explains this to a point is that in most instances, the volume controls read much higher than the tone controls. Now, the believed reason for that is, as guitarists, we do use the tone controls, but nowhere near as much as we're riding the volume controls. And over the space of 60 plus years, as you use a pot, the wiper drags along the carbon track and it will slowly start to wear away the resistive material. So over 60 years of using a volume pot all the time, that material will wear down and the value of the pot will shoot up, but that effect will be less in the tone pots because they don't get as much use. So what I'm going to do today is explore whether these higher valued pots can get us closer to what we hear as burst tone in 2022. Because if we go on a YouTube channel like Emerald City Guitar or Carter Vintage, we see all these amazing demos of those incredible old bursts, but recorded in 2022. And many of those guitars probably have pot values up in the 7, 8, 900k range rather than down in 500k. So if we're chasing after that particular recorded tone that was done in the 2020s with our burster-like Les Pauls, can we get closer using higher valued pots? So today I'm going to play a few things through my JTM 45 clone, and I'm just going to crank the amp today. I'm not going to bother with clean sounds because I think most people that want to hear a PAF equipped burst spec Les Paul just want to hear it through a screaming amp. And I'm going to play a few things with these linear taper 500-ish K nostalgic pots. And I'm then going to put in these much higher valued pots which have a log taper and see whether the fundamental sound with everything wide open is closer to what we associate with modern burst recorded tone. Now, I am going to experiment with rolling down the volume controls, but of course we need to be a bit careful with this, A, because the tapers are different, linear versus logarithmic, but also because if we did it in percentage terms of the overall pot value, all that would really show is 50% of a higher valued pot is more than 50% of a lower valued pot, and it wouldn't really tell us anything. So I'm going to roll down the linear taper 500k pot to a point on the knob. I haven't shot the footage yet, I'll just whatever feels right. And then I'll try and match it just using my ears to the logarithmic taper pots, listening back to the recorded audio, and see whether there's a fundamental difference in EQ rather than the pot value giving us more or less gain. I'm going to try and match the gain and see how it sounds. So I hope that makes sense. We just need to be a little bit careful of how we're sort of matching these two very different sets of pots up in terms of comparing their sonic differences. I will put on screen an explanation of what I'm doing when I'm doing that. So, without further ado, folks, here we go. there we are, folks. Now, please do comment underneath. Let me know which set of pots was your favourite in this guitar today and why. I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks down in the comments section. Now, in that original video, going from the VIPots to the equivalent value nostalgic pots, we heard there was definitely a difference, but it wasn't night and day. It was a fairly subtle change overall. And I think we heard a similar effect today. As you would expect, the higher value pots gave us a more kind of presence-y, glassy top end to the whole guitar, but overall it was a fairly slight change. But, as I always say, subtleties are what tone chasing is ultimately all about, right? Now, with everything wide open, I think I heard more of a difference on the neck pickup, and to me, the guitar really benefited from that extra kind of presence and chime in the top end with the higher valued pots. On the bridge pickup, the effect was a little bit more subtle, but there was still definitely a change. And to my ears, and this probably isn't what's happening in electronics engineering terms whatsoever, but the audible effect I was picking up on here in the room was with the lower valued pots, the guitar seemed to have slightly more of that upper mid-range snap to it. With the higher valued pots, there was less of that, but more kind of presence-y frequencies. So going between the two sets was just like nudging the upper mid-range emphasis around a little bit. But overall, it was fairly subtle once again. Now, as I said in the intro, rolling the volumes back was quite tricky because we were dealing with 500-ish K pots with a linear taper and 900 K pots with a logarithmic taper. So I had to use my ears and try and balance them out and get them in the sweet spot where they were fairly equivalent to each other. But I do think the higher valued pots retained more top end as we rolled them down to a similar level of gain with the amp here in the room. So you could argue that the higher values have a better cleanup on them because they stay more glassy clean and give us that kind of single coil effect that we know and love rolling volumes down with PAF pickups. I think the biggest change I heard today was with the volumes rolled back slightly, but the guitar in the middle position with both the pickups. And there was a video I was watching yesterday, I think it was an Emerald City guitar video, where they had a 1960 burst Les Paul. And the chap who was playing it was using that middle pickup position a lot. And the guitar was so spanky, it was almost like a fat Strat in that middle position. And I was definitely getting more of that out of this guitar today with the higher value pots in. So, which set was my favourite then? Well, I think I do generally prefer guitars with a lot of clarity to them. So I would probably say the higher value pots. And also, those do have the logarithmic taper. I'm not a linear taper person at all. I find it really difficult to use. So I was definitely preferring the taper of those log pots. But did they make the guitar sound more like a burst recorded in 2022 than the lower value pots? I don't know, so I'll tell you what, you let me know in the comments what you think. Which set of pots made this guitar sound closer to what you hear of burst Les Pauls recorded in modern demos? I'd love to get your thoughts and opinions on that. So thank you ever so much for watching, folks. I'll put a link to the nostalgic shop down in the description, so please go and check out some of these pots and wiring looms if you're into this sort of vintage Centralab type stuff. I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. Please do carry on subscribing. I know I always say it, but it makes a huge difference when you hit subscribe, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.